Did the latest administration of the digital SAT feel a lot harder than the practice tests? If you felt this way, you're not alone. I've gotten the same reaction from some of my students, and if you've spent a lot of time in the corners of the internet where people talk about the SAT, you may have noticed that a lot of people are complaining that the real test felt harder than the official practice tests available on Bluebook. So was it? The College Board, which is the company that makes the SAT, isn't very transparent about their operations, so it's hard to know for sure what was going on. But I've come up with 5 possible explanations about why the test may have felt harder than the practice tests. And in this video, we're going to go over those explanations and discuss what they mean for you, the test taker. So the digital SAT is an adaptive test. For each section, you get 2 modules, and if you perform well on the first module, you'll get a harder second module. But if you were practicing with linear versions of the test, you might not have been expecting that. Which brings us to our first explanation. The test felt harder because you got the harder second module. If that's the case, the fact that the test felt hard is actually good news for you because it means that you did well on the first module.
Mr. Greenberg.
What is it, student me?
But I also got the harder second module when I took the practice tests on Bluebook, and those felt way easier.
Okay, student me, that's a valid point. So for those of you who took the practice tests on Bluebook and who got the harder module 2 on those practice tests, and who still feel that the real test was harder, we're going to need another explanation. So let's move on to explanation number 2. Experimental questions. A lot of students aren't aware of this, but on every module of the test, there are 2 experimental questions. These are basically questions that the College Board puts in for their own development. They want to figure out if these questions are easy or hard, and to do that, they make you the guinea pig. Now, it's possible that on the most recent SAT, they were experimenting with some harder questions, and if that's the case, the entire test would have felt harder. But there is good news here for you as a test taker. If this is indeed the explanation, then you don't need to worry because those experimental questions are not counted towards your score. So even though they may have been hard, the questions that you actually had to answer that were counted may not have been any more difficult. But let's move on to the next explanation. It actually was harder. Now this may seem like bad news for you as a test taker, but if you think about it, it's really not. It's a fact that different administrations of the test will vary in terms of difficulty. But average scores from administration to administration remain fairly constant. That's because the score that you receive is not just a number of questions you got right. Rather, it's scaled. Now the College Board has a pretty good idea of which questions are easier or harder. That's what all those experimental questions are for. And when they convert your raw score to a scale score, that's taken into account. On a particularly easy administration of the test, getting one question wrong, especially in math, could knock you back 20 or 30 points. Whereas on a harder version, you may be able to get one wrong and still get a perfect score. So if that's what was going on here, then maybe the test really was harder. But that shouldn't be something that concerns you because the curve will likely be more generous and will make up for that.
Thanks, Mr. Greenberg. I feel much better now.
Well, student me, I'm happy to hear that. But unfortunately, there are 2 more explanations. So let's move on to the next one. Explanation number 4. Bias. Basically, if this explanation is true, the questions on the practice test didn't seem as hard to you because you'd seen them before.
But Mr. Greenberg, that's impossible. I was taking those practice tests for the first time, and they still felt easy.
That may be, student me, but that doesn't mean they were completely new to you. First, it's important to understand that there is a lot of repetition in the officially released questions. So even if you were taking those tests on Bluebook for the first time, if you had previously taken linear tests, or done questions in the question bank, or solved exercises on Khan Academy, or even watched many of the videos out there on YouTube, you would have seen some of the same questions already. But let's imagine that you didn't use any of those resources and you only use third-party books. Even still, you may have some bias, and here's why. Think about how those third-party resources are designed. They're usually modeled after questions that have been released by the College Board. So that surprising twist in a math question, or that obscure vocabulary word, it gets repeated again and again in other practice tests. But on the real test, you're probably not going to get that specific twist, or that specific obscure word. And that can make the real test feel a lot harder, because it's not giving you the same surprises that you're already used to. So if that's why the real SAT felt harder than the practice test, that's not great news for you, because it means you weren't as good as you thought you were. And what you found on the SAT, the real test, is actually more reflective of your real ability. But there is one other explanation, so let's move on to explanation number 5. Pressure. Let's face it, even if the real test was no harder than the practice tests, it may have felt harder because you were under a lot of pressure. Maybe you tried to take the practice tests under test-like conditions with the standard time limit and no extra breaks, but still, the real test feels different because it's real, and that's just something that you can't replicate in practice tests. I know this is common because it's something I've seen happen before. I've had students who take the test and they come to me afterwards and they say, "Mr. Greenberg, this test was hard. There was some grammar rule or some math principle that I've never seen before that we just didn't cover." Now, I'm always skeptical when I hear these claims. And later on, when that test is either released or leaked, and I go back and I look at the questions, I can see that they're not actually any harder, that they didn't test any new concepts. And so the only explanation that I can come up with is that the student kind of panicked because of the pressure. And to be honest, out of the 5 explanations that we've discussed so far, I personally think that this one is the most likely reason why the real test felt harder for you. And if that's the case, it's not great news. It may just mean that you don't perform as well under pressure. However, it is important to keep in mind that this is true for a lot of people, and if other students don't perform well under pressure, well, the competition isn't going to be doing any better either. Finally, you should keep in mind that these explanations are not mutually exclusive, so it is perfectly possible that there are several, if not all of these explanations going on together, making the real test feel harder than the practice tests. At any rate, regardless of what the real explanation was, I wouldn't encourage you to cancel your score or do something drastic unless you really feel that there was a reason why you performed worse than you otherwise should have. I've made a whole video on that topic, so you may want to check it out. I'd also like to end on one positive note. Many times students come to me complaining that the test felt much harder than the practice test, but when they wait and see, it turns out that their scores are actually as good or better than they were fearing. So wait and see. You may surprise yourself. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks as always for watching.